Whoever wrote the Gospels, those books are anonymous. The church chose the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they may as well have been written by Tom, Dick, and Harry. Now, this quote is from biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, and it's at the center point of a really interesting debate between Christian apologists on one hand and atheists on the other about whether or not we can trust the authorship of the Gospels. Well, I wanted to answer this question using just scholarly methods and scientific and statistical analysis. And I did just that, but I chose a really interesting method and I got really surprising results. So I'm really eager to share those results with all of you. And I think you'll agree with me by the end of the video that some of the conclusions that we find in this statistical analysis are very, very surprising. First, before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about this channel. I'm a university professor. I have some interest in some of these topics from just an amateurish perspective. I am a professor in a very different discipline, but I deal with statistical analysis in my academic work quite often. Now, although I spent several weeks on working on the research behind this video, I generated a spreadsheet by doing the research that I did over the last few weeks, and I'm making that spreadsheet available freely to all of you. So if you watch this video or if you don't watch it, you can still just have the spreadsheet. It's in the description. I'll put a link to it, and I'll also put a link to that spreadsheet in the comment section of this video. For those of you who aren't quite certain what I did in this video or who may not be able to make sense of some of the statistical analysis, I did do an in-depth explanation, and that's also in the description section and in the comments. And I'll also put a downloadable link to some of the stuff that I wrote about this. I'm not planning to publish any of this research, but if somebody looks at this spreadsheet and thinks it's publishable, you're welcome to reach out to me. My email address is on the channel description, so feel free to reach out if you have more questions. Before we dive into that statistical analysis directly, I do want to make a plug for the video. We're a new channel. I would love it if you like this video, click the like button. That's really helpful to us. It's exponentially more helpful to us because we're such a new and small channel. If you subscribe to the channel, that's also really very, very useful, and it really means a lot to us. The most nourishing thing for me is weighing in on the comment section because I really love to read your comments, and I've learned a lot from a lot of your comments. Several of you are very knowledgeable about these topics, so please weigh in on the comment section and let me know what you think of this analysis. And the last thing is click the bell icon for notifications. That'll make sure that you get notified about future videos that we make. All right, so let me sort of recap the problem that we're addressing in this video. So the problem is, can we trust the authorship of the Gospels as it is reported by the early Christian church? That's the main question that we're going to address in this video. Now, there's very strong argumentation on both sides. There's definitely evidence on both sides, but I think by using statistical analysis, we can come up with an answer to this question that's going to be very impartial. And I basically separated this question into two questions. Number one, I think this is a much more important question, by the way, than the question of who authored the Gospels. But the first question is, does the attribution within the Gospels, in other words, does the internal attestation of authorship or lack thereof match the pattern that we would expect to see based on other literature from that time? In other words, we all admit that the Gospels don't name the authors internally to those documents. So the Gospel of Matthew doesn't say, this is Matthew writing this Gospel. But my question was, does that conform or does that diverge from the accepted literary standards from that period? So that was the first question I wanted to answer. The second question is, what about the later attributions? So we all know, and this is all agreed upon by everyone, that the early Christian founders, the early Christian church, attributed the Gospels to their respective authors. So early church fathers or figures attributed the Gospels to the authors Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But can we trust those attributions? And was that pattern of attribution what we see when we look at other things from the literature? And I found some very surprising conclusions, especially on this point. All right, so now that we've clarified what the two questions are that we have, let's dive into the statistical analysis. In the first section, I'm going to tell you exactly what I did. And in the second section, I'm going to answer those two questions specifically in their own subsections. All right, so I'll tell you what I did first of all. So what I did is I collected as much literature as I could between 100 BCE and 100 CE. Now, by the way, just for my own brevity and also to connect with most of the people who are probably watching this video, I'm just going to use BC and AD because I think that's easier to just for people to understand. So I went from basically a 200-year period, essentially, from 100 BC to 180, and I looked at all the works of literature that I could find in that period. I did dismiss a lot of works that were so fragmentary that we don't really have any accurate assessment of whether or not there would be internal attestation of authorship. So what I ended up with was 95 works total. Now, of those 95 pieces of literature from 100 BC to 180, I took out 23 pieces of literature that are known to be anonymous with no attribution of authorship. In other words, those were things that we know are anonymous, that we don't have any way of figuring out what the authorship is. And the historical and scholarly tradition on all of those works were all that these have been anonymous works since they were essentially written. So I took those 23 works out of the analysis. That left me with 72 works remaining. Now, I looked at those 72 works, and I tried to figure out what percentage of those works are internally anonymous, just like the Gospels. So in other words, what percentage of those works don't list the author explicitly and by name within the work itself? So, and that was the first question that I had. So if you take that whole body of literature, all 72 works, including Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources, then there are 52 sources within that body of work that don't mention the author explicitly and specifically by name in the work itself. So these are 52 works where the author is at least internally anonymous, just like the Gospels. So in other words, just like the Gospels, for these 52 works, there's no internal, if you had the work and you read it through, you would have no way of knowing who specifically wrote that piece of literature, just like the Gospels. So in other words, we have 52 pieces of literature. Now, by the way, I should say that I restricted my analysis to only works from the Greco-Roman culture, Christianity, and Jewish culture. Now, the reason why I didn't go into Asia is because I really wanted to get a sense of what were authorship attestation standards for that specific culture in and around the Roman Empire. And I felt like if I went into too many other cultures and too many other literary traditions, that I would have meaningless conclusions. All right, so hopefully that's all clear. So 72 works where we now know, or at least some community purports to understand what the authorship is. And of those 72 works, in 52 of those works, the authorship from the internal document itself, from the internal piece of literature that you'd be holding in your hand if you read the entire work of literature. So 52 of those 72 works don't have the author listed within the document itself. All right, so now my next question was, what is the odds ratio of some of those documents being Christian or from outside of Christianity? In other words, we now know the overall percentage of how likely it is for one of those works from that time period to not mention the authorship internally. Is there a statistically significant difference between internal attestation of authorship if you look at the Christian works within that number of 72 works versus the non-Christian works? So basically what I had was 7 different Christian works, including 4 Gospels and 3 letters of Paul. And then I had 65 works that are non-Christian. And all right, so how many of those works were internally anonymous? Well, there were 4 works within the Christian literature that were internally anonymous and 3 works where the author's name is listed. And in the non-Christian literature, we have 48 works that don't list the internal author and 17 where the internal author is listed within the work. And by the way, there's no title pages during this time period. So essentially, if the author's name is not listed within the work, we're calling that essentially an anonymous work by the standard that the Gospels are also called anonymous. I hope that makes sense. All right, so now it should be immediately apparent that the Gospels are within what we would expect with this group. In other words, within this group overall, about 72% of all works did not have an internal author attribution. So we shouldn't be surprised that none of the Gospels have an internal attribution of authorship. But let's try to be more statistically precise with our analysis, because I think statistics forces us to make a conclusion that makes us be a little bit more objective. All right, so what I used is Fisher's exact test. Now, I'm not going to dive too much into the statistical analysis because I don't want to lose too many people, but I will say this is an appropriate test to use. It's a statistical test used to analyze the relationship between 2 categorical variables when we have small sample sizes. So what I like about Fisher's test, it also generates a p-value. So it tells us if the associations that we're looking at are significant. All right, now more about that in just a second. But first of all, it should be obvious to everyone that, so Christian works, how likely are they to be anonymous? So that's 4 out of the 7 Christian works, or 57% of them. And for the non-Christian works, there's actually a slightly higher percentage. So we've got about 48 out of 65 sources in the non-Christian literature from that era, or 74%, which are anonymous. All right, so it's probably apparent to all of you that this is not likely to be a statistically significant difference, okay? Okay, now that's important because that tells us that the authorship attestations within the Gospels are within the standard for what we would expect for literature from this period. Okay, now let's look at that a little more specifically. So what is the p-value of the difference between 57% out of the 7 cases versus 74% out of the 65 cases? Well, that p-value comes out to 0.388. So that is not statistically significant. In other words, if I had to argue that there's a reason why there was a difference in percentage, I would essentially be saying that there's a 38% chance that we would expect this difference to emerge from chance alone. Generally, a p-value of 0.05 is considered significant, which means that there's only a 5% chance that the results that we're seeing are expected from chance alone. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's another way that I can say it that is maybe a little bit more accessible to most of the people watching this video. Essentially, what I'm saying is, we note that a lot of the Christian sources are anonymous, and specifically all 4 Gospels are anonymous. But we note that out of the non-Christian literature, quite a few works, there are about 74% actually, are also internally anonymous. So in other words, if we pejorate the Gospels by saying, well, we can't trust them because they're internally anonymous, then we have to throw out a lot of the other literature also. And that's not consistent with scholarly historical analysis. So in other words, what I'm saying is we shouldn't apply our modern standards for authorship attestation to this specific era. Instead, what we should look at, which is maybe a more relevant question, is do the Gospel methods of internally failing to describe their authorship, does that conform with what we would expect from this era? And indeed, this statistical analysis does prove quite definitively that it does. In fact, if anything, the trend goes slightly in a different direction. But essentially what we've done is we've answered the question by saying the authorship from the lack of attestation of the authorship within the 4 Gospels is exactly what we would expect to see from literature from this time period. Now, I'll do a little bit more of a philosophical analysis on what that means at the end of the video, and I'll tell you what my own feelings are. But let's move on to the second part of our analysis, because I think we've conclusively demonstrated now at this point that there's not a reason to sort of hold the Gospels to a different standard than other literature from that era. And if we look at the standard for authorship attribution from that era, we're basically coming to the conclusion that the authorship of the Gospels, or the lack of authorship within the Gospels, is exactly what we would expect to see. All right, now the next question that I had, which I think is a much more interesting one, is what is the difference in timing between the work itself and the attribution of authorship? And I looked at the first attribution and the second attribution. All right, so for this step in the analysis, I wanted to see what is the time lag between the first attribution and what is the time lag to the second attribution. So in other words, if we look at Christian literature and if we also look at non-Christian literature, is there a difference in the pattern of attribution that we see in terms of the time lag between the first and second attributions? And what does that tell us about the trustability of these works? So, all right, so this was really interesting to me. So I hope this makes sense. I'm basically looking at who's the first person outside of the Gospels who says that the Gospels were written by the person that they were authored by. That's basically the thing that I'm asking. And I asked that for essentially all 72 pieces of literature in this study. And again, if you want to check my data, all the data sheets will be available. All right, so what's the year of the first attribution? What's the year of the second attribution? And what is the year of the original work? All right, those are the questions that were relevant to the second part of the analysis. All right, so very interestingly, this showed us some really interesting results. All right, so the first attribution for the Christian sources, and this is all of the Christian sources, and there's a lot of different ways to parse out this literature. So again, the spreadsheets are available if you want to do the calculations in a different way. But for all Christian sources, the first attribution was 63.3 years, and the second attribution was on average 89.0 years. Again, these are actually all averages. For non-Christian sources, what were the average durations? So between the writing of the work and the actual first and second attributions for non-Christian sources, so other than the Gospels and the letters of Paul, was 162.7 years for the first attribution and 284.6 years for the second attribution. Now, this is really fascinating because this shows that the attribution is actually much earlier for Christian works. And again, I'm skipping over some of the statistical analysis, but for this portion of the statistical analysis, I used a 2-sample t-test for independent groups. So that's the means that I use to calculate these p-values. All right, so what about the first attribution lag? Is that significant? Well, the answer is yes. So the p-value for that was 0.00005. So that means that there's a very low likelihood that we would get this result by accident. The second attribution, the p-value, I'll put it on the screen, but it's a much, much smaller number. So essentially what this information is telling us is that there is, for some reason, the Christian, and this doesn't tell us why this happened, but for some reason, Christian attributions, both for the first and second attribution, are much earlier than for literature elsewhere in the world. Now, this kind of makes sense in a lot of ways if you think about it, because there was sort of an intellectual Christian of the early church. Record keeping was much more rigorous, and there was sort of some structure to the Christian church, so they kind of established early on what their canon is. So I think for a lot of these reasons, we have a lot of documents from early Christianity, whereas there weren't a whole lot of libraries that were preserved from the rest of literature, Greco-Roman or Jewish literature. So, but anyways, for whatever reason, these attributions are much earlier for Christian sources than they are for other sources. All right, now let's maybe ask now a more philosophical question, which is, what does this analysis tell us? All right, well, I would say conclusion number one is that this analysis tells us that we should expect that the authorship of the Gospels would be internally anonymous. So if we expect the Gospels to conform on a tabula rasa level to other literary standards of the time, then we should not expect the authors of the Gospels to be internally named within the documents. So this is just what we expect. All right, conclusion number two. Interestingly, for whatever reason, Christian attribution seems to be very early compared to other works when we look at other works that originated during this time period. Now, that's interesting. I think you can posit what a mechanism for that is. Now, here's the more philosophical question. What does this say about whether or not we can trust the Gospels? Well, so most scholars are very skeptical and very reluctant to assign authorship to the Gospels to their reported authors. Now, that's not all scholars. Some scholars say that, some Gospels are more likely to be attributed to the specific authors. I kind of like the perspective that, Matthew probably didn't literally write the Gospel of Matthew, but it was probably people who were around Matthew or people who were in the community of Matthew. I kind of like that because I think there is sort of a degree to which authorship is essentially preserved, but maybe Matthew wasn't like physically writing the words. That's just something that appeals to me philosophically. That's not necessarily supported by any data. But I do think that, so the next question that emerges from the statistical analysis is, do we have a double standard? In other words, if scholars are very critical and very skeptical in their perspective of whether or not the Gospels were written by their putative or reported authors, then is that a double standard, given that we have this other body of literature where we accept virtually all of the authorship as reported, but and we don't ask the same questions, or we don't hold those works to the same standard of rigor in terms of determining whether or not the authors are the correct people who we think that they are based on history. So in other words, this question gets to the heart of, do we have a double standard? Now, the answer is, I think quite obviously, that yes, we have a double standard, but that's not a judgment call on my part. In other words, double standards are okay. We have double standards that we use every day. And for instance, we don't let blind people drive, so it's appropriate to have a double standard. Most scholars have commented on the fact that biblical scholarship is held to a higher standard critically than the standard for other literature from antiquity. Now, I'm going to make the argument that that's appropriate, right? Because biblical scholarship or biblical writing from antiquity is theologically motivated. So it's okay to say, like, hey, we should have a higher standard for what we consider to be true based on these things. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons that why we should be a little more lax in that standard in this case. Reason number one is because the attributions for Christian works do seem to be very early on. Okay. Number two, there does seem to be a consensus among early Christians about some works, whereas other works that are anonymous are more open-ended. So if we, for instance, look at the work Hebrews and compare that to the Gospels, Hebrews is much more notably anonymous. Nobody really knows who wrote it, whereas the Gospels, there is sort of that early on consensus, which I think makes the analysis and the reporting more trustworthy. Now, let me get to another question, which is, to what extent do we need to verify information that's theological? And that's obviously to a much more rigorous standard. However, when it comes to information that's not theological, the real philosophical question is, do we have to have such a high standard? And let me give you an intellectual exercise that really crystallizes this. All right, let's say I have Christians, Jews, and Romans that attest to a miraculous event, which is an earthquake. And they all say, God made an earthquake, and they all interpret that earthquake in different ways. So the question is, does that mean the earthquake happened? Or should we be more skeptical because it's coming from religious sources? I think the answer is no, we don't need to be more skeptical. In other words, we can say, yes, an earthquake happened. In terms of ascribing that earthquake to a theological causality, that's something we should definitely be more skeptical about. So if you say God came down and spoke and then the earthquake happened, that is a very different argument. But if you're just saying the earthquake happened and it happened because God was angry, well, you can still look at the evidence and say the earthquake happened. So hopefully that's clear enough. So in other words, in terms of, there's a lot of scholarship, there's a lot of criticality in the scholarship towards events that are miraculous. But I think if you have an event that is not miraculous, or at least can be put in a bin where you don't have to ascribe a miraculous etiology to it, then you can take that event with, just as much, or just as little of a grain of salt as other historical events. So hopefully that's clear. So the reason why I bring this up is because I think when it comes to the authorship of the Gospels, that is not something that is necessarily miraculous. So the question is, do we need to have such a high standard for figuring out who wrote the Gospels? I think you can make the argument that the standard doesn't need to be as high. I think you could also make the argument that maybe the standard should be a little bit higher. But if you're saying that the standard should be higher, then I think that argument should be mitigated at least a little bit by the fact that we do have earlier attestations from the Christian works. Now, ultimately, this is a question for the academic community to answer, and that's a much longer process. What I really liked about performing this analysis is that I really like academic and intellectual rigor and scrupulousness. I do feel like in the field of biblical scholarship, that's missing. And that's an accusation that obviously should be levied to all parties in this conversation. In other words, obviously, the intellectual scrupulousness and the academic rigor of Christian apologetic literature is horrifically atrocious. Okay, I totally agree with that. But I think there's a degree to which we've let a lot of the scholarly or secular research about the Bible become really directed by people who have a bit of an atheistic or an anti-theistic bent. So I guess the summary take-home message from this video is that my personal philosophical opinion is that I think that the authorship is pretty trustworthy. There are certainly some we should be skeptical. I'm fairly agnostic about these points, so I'm generally pretty skeptical, but I think probably at least some of the gospel authors are the people who we have reported and associated with names. I do think that coming back to the beginning of this video, that Bart Ehrman's argument that the gospels could have been named Tom, Dick, and Harry and it would have made exactly the same difference, I think that's a hyperbolic statement that he's putting out there as a rhetorical flourish. I don't think it's supported by the statistical analysis that I've done, and I don't think it's supported by the academic scholarship around this set of questions. This was a really fun thing for me to look into. I really enjoyed doing the research on this one. I would love to know what you think. Do you think after reviewing all the statistical analysis, is your opinion about the authorship of the Gospels the same? That's my question to all of you. Do you think that, maybe a lot of people are starting to sort of coalesce around the conclusion that Luke probably wrote Luke, probably Mark wrote Mark, but maybe some of the other authorship is not really known. So I kind of like that opinion, but I really want to know what you all think. My other question to you is, does this statistical analysis move the needle? I do think that people are really wrapped up in a lot of the emotion around some of these arguments between atheists and apologists. And I think looking at statistical analysis helps to mitigate what our own internal emotional biases are. And lastly, I want to invite you, if you've enjoyed this video and you like the statistical analysis that I've done and you're an academician, please take these spreadsheets and run with them, and you can reach out to me. I'm happy to collaborate if you'd like that. Again, I work in a very different field, but I'll happily add my name as an author to any of these works. All right, well, thanks very much. We are a new channel, so just one more quick plug. Please like this video. This took weeks of work, so I would really appreciate the like. Please subscribe to the channel. As a small channel, that helps us so exponentially more than some of the larger channels, so please subscribe. Click the bell icon for notifications, and please contribute to the comment section. I really want to know what you think about this question. Can we trust the Gospels? And can we answer that question statistically? I've had so much fun doing this video. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for supporting the video. I did put a link at the end of this video for my last video that I did, which was a video that's just more personally meaningful about my father. So please check that out as well. Well, thanks again for tuning in, and as always, please have a really wonderful day.